Hi, everyone. Welcome to Engage 2020 Summer Series. My name is Viviette White. I'm one of the librarians at the Allegra Westbrooks Regional Library here at Betty's Ford Road in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am proud to present Engage 2020 Summer Series tonight with Dr. Dante Bryant. Dr. Bryant is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work and College of Human and Health Services. He is also an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Africana Studies and UNCC SSW Race and Social Equity Academy. Dr. Bryant joined the UNC-Charlotte faculty after serving more than 2 decades in community organizing, social activism, social service program evaluation, implementation, and development, and local governmental policy reform. Dr. Bryant's research and writings utilize multiple theoretical, methodological, and disciplinary approaches to examine racial, institutional inequity, and Black and white body politics within mainstream America social discourses. Man, that's a mouthful. In addition, Dr. Bryant's research actively explores the intersectional implications of race, gender, and theory for social work, education, practice, and pedagogy. I am so excited that you're here today. You have layers of information on your bio. We can go on and talk about that, but that is not the topic tonight.
No, it is
Tonight,
not.
we're going to focus on America in Black and White. And a part of our Engage 2020 series with the Public Library of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, we are looking back and moving forward. And tonight, we are moving forward with you, Dr. Bryant. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I enjoyed meeting with you the other day, right?
Yeah, it was great.
Conversation. So I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm ready to go when you are. So just you give me the nod and we can get started, I guess.
Well, I give you the nod, and I feel like I dream of Jeannie, and here we go.
All right. So the point of this conversation is to talk about America in Black and White, and to really look at the history of Black racial progress and white resistance and the unspoken truth of racial identity, specifically as they relate to Blacks and whites in this country. Jeremy, next slide, please. Before we get started, I typically do this whenever I have conversations with people, just trying to give people a basic framework on some of the terms that may be used. So when we're talking about racism as behavioral, talking about a conscious or unconscious beliefs that a person's race or pigment determines like their status in society or their biological value, right? I'm talking about racism as a social institutional. We're talking about social institutions, policies, systems in government, et cetera, based upon the doctrine that someone's pigment matters, right? And that they will judge them based on their pigment. Then we have the white supremacy as systemic, and white supremacy as in terms of systemic is really about systems, policies, procedures, systems, institutions that prioritize Eurocentric values, norms, and privilege them above other races. And then we have anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness is a little bit different. It's resistance or antagonism specifically targeting Black people. Their values, objectives, lived experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's important to remember is that racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness are all very different aspects of our existing society. So you can have a racist society that's not necessarily anti-Black, right? And you can have a racist society that's not white supremacist. So white supremacy is a particular type of racism, right? So you can't have white supremacy without having racism, but you can have racism without white supremacy, if that makes sense, right? But in a white supremacist society, at least as it's constructed with the United States, right? White supremacy goes hand in hand with anti-Blackness. So white supremacy is a very specific type of racism that demands, at least within the United States, a form of anti-Blackness. All right. So just to make sure that that's clear before we move forward. So what we're going to do is, and Jeremy, you can go to the next slide. what we're going to do is walk through really like a history of Black racial advancements and how white America has historically responded. When I say white America, clearly it's not everyone in white America, because there have always been white people who have always sided with the advancement of Black folks in this country, right? As far back as the abolitionist movement. But so when we're talking about resistance from white America, racial issues persist in this country in terms of white supremacy, in large part because we have not gotten to a critical mass of white people at this point who are willing to undo it, right? It doesn't mean there's not a lot who are not trying to, but we haven't reached critical mass yet. And until we reach critical mass, we'll continue to have issues of white supremacy, racism, and anti-Blackness within this country. So just kind of put that in some kind of context. So we start with slavery, right? 1619 to 1865, 80% of the nation's gross national products comes out of slavery. And we have emancipation in 1864 to 1865. All right, next slide, Jeremy. And emancipation is a huge deal. It's an absolutely huge deal, right? And it kind of ushers us into this period of Reconstruction. And this is when you start hearing about the Freedmen's Bureau, right? General Sherman, who allocated 400,000 acres to 40,000 former slaves, right? Because what you have in the South now is that the South is conceded. And so now a lot of these plantations are no longer operating. The people who once owned the plantations have now been captured by the North, right? And are awaiting trial, and likely trial to be hung, right? As treasons to the country and so forth. And so all these lands are vacant. And so General Sherman says, okay, well, let's take these 400,000 acres, give them to at least 40,000 former slaves so they can start to build their own wealth, their own economies, and their own systems. Right, General Oliver Howard, Circular 13, the 40 acres and a mule, right? This is what we always get in terms of reparations. Exactly right. So he says, well, let's also lease out 40 acres and a mule to former slaves so they can also too begin to build their own wealth. Right. So this is right. This is what's happening right after emancipation. And this is considered the Reconstruction era, right? Between 64 and 77. But what ends up happening is in 1865, Andrew Johnson replaces Lincoln in the White House. And the moment he steps into the White House, he immediately begins to roll back all of the advancements during the Reconstruction era. So he undercuts the Freedmen's Bureau. Circular 13, he cancels it. And then he pardons all the leaders of the Confederate South. He pardons them, gives their land back to them, right? Then allocates land through the Homestead Act, about 160 acres in the West, to poor white families, grants amnesty to all Confederate leaders, allowed them to reclaim their land and move back into their spaces. And he literally says, this is a country for white people. And as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white people, right? So this is the man who's elected immediately after Lincoln. So Lincoln comes in, he ushers in the emancipation. We have the Reconstruction era. We think we're headed in the right direction. America elects Andrew Johnson, who comes literally and wipes all of it out. And so what ends up happening is you have all of these freed Black slaves, former slaves, in the Confederate South. They're working land, they're building homes. And then Johnson says, listen, all of you former slave owners, go back and take your land. And so then what you see is this mass murders of Black folk all across the Confederate South. Next slide, please. I mean, between 1865 and 1868, roughly 1,000 Black people were lynched in Texas alone, right? And you also saw during that same time was the first rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Out of Tennessee. They begin to develop during the same era. Because right now it's about, listen, you have legal authority to go back and take your land from these Black folk who are currently occupying it. Now, what's astounding about this, right, which absolutely blows me away, is the simple fact that more people died during the Civil War than almost every war, American war since then combined.
Wow.
Right? And the people who we fought against were sitting, so you have the Confederates and you have the Confederate South and you have the Republic sitting next to each other. And across the table from you is someone who was responsible for killing your daughter, your son, your nephew, your brother, your husband, whoever it may be. And the president decided that it was more important to ensure that Blacks were not able to advance than it was to punish the people who actually murdered his sons and uncles. And you see what I'm saying? Like, and this is kind of the mind frame that's taking place, right? I would rather forgive you for killing my son and send you back so that you can make sure that because it's more important that Black people not advance than it is for me to persecute you for killing my son or for rebelling against the country, right? Which is an astounding concept. And so you have that happening. And then what emerges immediately after that are Black codes, right? And Black codes initially, it popped up in Mississippi initially, and were quickly replicated throughout the Confederate South. And what Black codes was really an effort to reinstitutionalize slavery in a more legal fashion, so to speak. So what it did was it said that if you were a Black person, one, you had to be employed, but your employment, you had to be under contract with a plantation, a mill, a lumber yard, mining, or some type of home service work, okay? You had to have a contract. What you could not do, you could not dispute the amount of money you were paid. You could not leave that person if you were unhappy with your working conditions. You could not prosecute them for improper working conditions. You could not own your own property. You could not hunt. You could not fish. You could not own a gun, right? And you could not produce any products that would allow you to ensure your own livelihood. And if you did, then you would be locked up under vagrancy laws. Right? So if you violated these Black codes, we would lock you up under vagrancy laws. And so this is the first time you see an explosion in our prison population. Right? And if you were incarcerated under the vagrancy laws, then what happened was you could be sold to a plantation owner to work for free. Right? And so essentially what this did is just reinstitutionalize slavery in a different form. But it also served as kind of the first framework for understanding how to use the prison system to ensure cheap labor, right? And to ensure the marginalization of Black people in this country, right? We kind of became the model for that. So you get Black codes finally ends around 67. And you have a gap between 67, the ending of Black codes, and the beginning of Jim Crow. Now, what's astounding is at the end of the Black codes, there were 0 Black people in political positions in the South, right? In 1867. Within 3 years, 15% of all Southern elected officials were Black, literally in a 3-year period, right? And so immediately how the country responds is, at least the Confederate South, is by implementing Jim Crow laws. Next slide, please. And again, the purpose of Jim Crow laws were because now we just had Black codes, and Black people still were able to come out of that and still make progress. We went in a 3-year period, we went from 0 elected officials in the Confederate South to having holding 15% of all elected official positions in the Confederate South in a 3-year period, which is absurd. I don't know that we've ever had 15% would literally be equitable representation of Black people in this country today, right? And I don't know that we even have that now. But they were able to do it in a very short period of time, which then ushered into Jim Crow, right? And so now what you're having is you're still having this roughly 100 people are being lynched at this time per year. Well, but actually between 100 to 300 people are being lynched in the Confederate South every year, right? During this time period. And of the people who are being lynched, about 90% of them are Black. Between Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, and Alabama, they're accounting for about 50% of all the lynchings in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. And what you also see during this time is the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan, right? What's also notable is in 1917, Birth of a Nation was released, right? And it was played in the White House, right? Of all the places. And every president, I think up until either Bush or Clinton, watched this movie in the White House.
Wow.
Right? Birth of a Nation gave rise to the second movement of the Klan. Now, all of a sudden, the Klan, which initially was trying to get Black people off of land that the government had given to them and then told them that they couldn't have, right? But now the Klan has taken on this whole new identity around the protecting the ethical and moral identity of white America. And the way they do that is by basically persecuting Black America. And so the population and participation in the Ku Klux Klan exploded. So by 1920, you literally have about 7 million people who are active Klan members. Now, what's astounding about this is that if you look in the, let's see, 1860 census, right, roughly about 50 years earlier, when they took the census, there were 6 million white people in the Confederate South prior to the start of the Civil War. By 6 million. By 1917, there were 7 million active members in the Klan, right? And so all of this is kind of this response to, again, Black progress, right? And so, of course, Black people started leaving because they actually could. And so between 1916 and 1970, we heard what they call the Great Migration, where Black people started fleeing the South, where I think almost 80 to 90% of all Blacks lived at the time and started going north, right? Between 1970 and 1918, we had 500,000 Black people who left the South, went north of the Mason-Dixon, 6 million total, right? And they were going in large part, not because the North was like this wonderful place, because the North had Jim Crow laws as well, but they were less restrictive, right? And so you could actually earn a living. You could have a profession. You were still segregated, but at least you had the opportunity. One, you didn't have to worry about being killed at any given moment, right? Because there's 100 Black people being lynched every year, and that's just lynchings that were recorded, between 100 to 200 to 300 that are recorded. That doesn't talk about rapes. That doesn't talk about beatings. It doesn't talk about burning of houses and churches, all things which we didn't document, right? And so people are fleeing to the North. So the Confederate South decides to pass anti-migration laws, which makes it illegal for a Black person to leave their state. And so what they do is they set up law enforcement officers, right? And this is kind of where we start to see the deploying of law enforcement as a means of policing Black people and Black bodies, right? This kind of state-sanctioned violence or government-sanctioned violence in the form of law enforcement, right? Because we've seen it throughout history. Yeah. And so law enforcement officers would literally line up at the train station. And if you were Black and you were caught trying to get on a train, they would then incarcerate you, which then meant you could be sold as free labor, right? They actually tried to get, I forget who the major train company was at the time, but they tried to get them to deny passage to Black people trying to leave. That didn't work out, right? They were like, well, they're paying customers. If they want to pay, we'll take their money, right? But so the Confederate South did everything it could to ensure they literally made it illegal for Black people to leave. The only way they could catch a train legally is if they had a permission slip from whoever they were contracted to work for. And so this is where you get the anti-migration laws. But again, Black people are fleeing violence and still trying to progress. Next slide, please. And so now after this, Black people come back out of another act of persecution, right? And the civil rights movement starts. And what's amazing, between 1954 and 1968, 64, we see the Civil Rights Act bill. We see 1965, we see the Voting Rights Act. Black registered voters literally tripled in almost every Southern state, like literally tripled, right? The largest increase in the Black middle class that this country had ever seen. We saw more Black people attending college during this particular time than we ever had in previously in history, right? And so what we're getting now we are developing Black middle class communities. We're developing Black wealth. We're developing Black businesses, all during the civil rights era, right? And what ends up happening is right as the civil rights movement kind of hits its pinnacle, right? We have 65 as the Voting Rights Act. King is killed shortly thereafter, right? And Nixon comes into power. Now, what's fascinating is Nixon runs on the platform of vote like your whole world depends on it. His primary talking points were the war on drugs, right? Now, what's fascinating about this, right, is that Gallup took a poll during Nixon's campaign. Less than 2% of the US population even knew or thought that drugs were an issue, right? But this was part of his campaign. Law and order. Now, stop me when any of this sounds familiar, right? The war on drugs, law and order, tough on crime, taking back America, right? And these are his major talking points, all under the umbrella of vote like your whole world depends on it. Nixon was quoted, that he was asked about his campaign slogan, and he literally said, "It's all about the damn Negroes and Puerto Rican groups out there," right? His domestic policy chief, you can see the quote there. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black," right? And so essentially what they did is decided to associate white kids with smoking marijuana, Blacks with smoking, I think, heroin, I believe it was at the time, right? And they knew that they were lying, but they knew if they could push this agenda, right, that they could win the election. And Nixon won in a landslide, like an absolute landslide. He garnered the Democratic vote and the Republican vote. I think like 60% of the popular vote went to Nixon during this particular campaign.
Wow.
Right. And again, this is a reaction to the civil rights movement. Black people again are making progress. And then white America is like, oh, we need to pull back on some of that a bit. So they elect Nixon. Now, what's fascinating is right after Nixon, who else gets elected? Immediately following Nixon, we get who? Reagan, right? Reaganomics, right? And Reagan's literally, his campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again." Like that was Reagan's campaign slogan. And he doubled down on Nixon's war on drugs and tough on crime, right? And while Nixon stated the war on drugs, Reagan actually acted it out. He actually declared it and put political and economic will behind it, right? Reagan is when we first start to hear about the welfare queen, right? Predators, right? Nixon's campaign people told him very specifically, you can't say the N-word anymore and expect to get elected. So what Nixon ushers in to political speech is political correctness, ways of talking about minorities without talking about them, right? He ushers that in. Reagan perfects it, right? Reagan perfects it. So Reagan says, let's make America great again. The war on drugs, tough on crime. We're going to do this. He secured 22% of the Democratic vote, right? And clearly won overwhelming majority of the Republican vote as well. During Reagan's time, FBI anti-drug funding, I think between like 1980 and 1984, he increased them from like 8 million to 94 million, right? He increased the Department of Defense funding against drugs from 1981 to 1999 from 33 to 100 million. DEA funding right? During that same period, went from 38 million to 181 million. Now, mind you, while this is happening, he's also defunding drug treatment programs. He decreased them from 274 million down to 57 million. Educational after school and treatment programs decreased them from 14 down to 3 million, right? And these are overwhelmingly impacting Black communities.
It
right?
sounds very, very familiar.
It does sound very familiar, doesn't it? And then, you know, we have Bush, who then picks up on that same discourse. And then we have Clinton, who was like, during the 90s, was like de facto the first Black president, right? Like, that's how we used to talk about Clinton.
Exactly.
But if you actually look at what he did politically, he came in the door stating, no Republican will be tougher on crime than me, right? And so when Clinton came in office, and he was right, we had the 3 strikes rule. 16 billion for prison grants, 17 billion to build prisons out, to build new prisons, 19 billion to build prisons out. 17 billion was taken from public housing, then given to contract to build more prisons, right? The prison population between Reagan and Clinton increased from 350,000 to 2.5 million people.
Wow.
On any given day, 65 to 85% of the people who were in prison at any given time, 65 to 85% of people were Black. Now, what's fascinating, this is about the war on drugs, right? But what's amazing is 80% of the drug convictions during that time were for simple possession of marijuana. And simple possession of marijuana, during that time, people were serving 5 to 15 years. And simple possession means you have enough marijuana to smoke. That's it. You do not have enough to even have intent to sell.
And we know who was targeted.
Exactly. Now, but
a very cheap bag of marijuana too.
It was a very cheap bag of marijuana.
I believe they call it nickel.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But this is still a reaction to the civil rights movement. Right? It's kind of advancement of Black people in this country. And you have this backlash. Again, you have this backlash and you also see during that time, the hyper militarization of the police department, kick-in door policies were used, right? We saw this when NWA kind of went public with the whole F the police thing, right? About what was going on in California in terms of the number of Black people who were being killed and beaten and abused by law enforcement officers under the guise of the war on drugs, keeping America safe, right, and being tough on crime, right? Because you have to police these particular bodies. And so then, next slide, please. Oh, go back one more slide. I'm sorry. Go back one time for me. I apologize. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Very thorough.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of sitting back, but there's a lot of information to cover.
Yeah, no, it is.
We see it repeated, from the early days on with the incarceration. You talk about Black lives being kept in incarceration or a type of slavery even after slavery. Yes. And then now today we see minor offenses like marijuana or possession of something that seems illegal.
Yep.
And those jail cells are just filling up at a high rate with Black men, mostly Black men, and Black women as well,
No, definitely. And and I think that's the thing, right? And I think that's the theme here is you see this kind of consistent cycle. You see Black progress, but you see similar reaction, right, from America as it relates specifically to Black progress. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, some reasons why that may be. But we still have more, right? We still have more. So then we survive Clinton, and we make it to Obama, right? And what's super interesting to me about this particular time period is during Obama's first run up to presidency, we saw the largest increase in newly registered voters we had ever seen in this country, right? Particularly amongst Black and Hispanic voters. The percentage of Black voters who show up at the polls, one of the few times in history, it actually mirrored the percentage of white voters who showed up at the polls. Additionally, what you also had was Obama during his first run won 95% of the Black vote, 60% of the Hispanic vote, and 43% of the white vote. Now, what's really interesting here is this is the first time, at least that I'm aware of, in the history of this country, that a president was elected but only won the minority of the white vote. Right? It's the first president who ever gets placed into the Oval Office who did not win the majority of the white vote. Right? So this is literally the president of the people of color or Black folk, right? Now, you can debate all day whether or not his policies or practices had any positive impacts on the Black community or not. That's a debate for another time. But at the very least, symbolically, his stepping into that position, literally within about 50 years of Black people just becoming full legal citizens, right? People forget, right? We did not become fully legal citizens until 1965.
Wow.
Right? And here we are, literally with almost a 50-year period, we go from being partial citizens to actually a Black person being in the White House. Now, what else is going on during this same time, right? During this kind of run up to the 2009 campaign, there's some other things that are happening as well. Education amongst Black people are starting to uptick in terms of their participation in education, post-secondary education. We're starting to see another burst or increase in Black people moving into the middle class. Black women are becoming the most educated population in the country at this time. And sociologists and demographers have realized that there are more children born of color during this time than there were white children. And if you do the second and third grade census, what they found was that there were more children of color in second and third grade than there were white children, which means soon down the line, whites will become a minority in this country. So all of this is happening, right, during the Obama campaign. All of these conversations are taking place, so forth and so on. Obama gets elected. Now, he gets elected, then he gets reelected, right? Now, what's also astounding, 2013 case, Shelby Court versus Holder. Ring any bells?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking about the Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act.
Yep.
Right? And this is coming up for termination. And in the 2013 case with Shelby, the court decides that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional because the formula has not been updated. And because the formula has not been updated, it cannot be applied to the Confederate States anymore. Now, for those who don't know what Section 4 is, essentially what Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act does, well, what it did was it said, if you have a history of voter suppression, which is literally the entire Confederate South, right? Because you have this gross history, actually, of voter suppression, you cannot make any changes to your voter registration practices without passing them first to the Supreme Court. So if you decide you want to change where a poll is, or you want to, implement voting ID laws, you have to submit this to the Supreme Court. We have to sign off on it, and then you can do it, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that there's actually an out clause that if you can demonstrate that not only are you not currently participating in voter suppression, but you're actually trying to increase voter access, then you could be exempt from the law. And out of the 11 Confederate states, only one of them actually applied and got it, and that was the state of Virginia. Every other state remained under the Voting Rights Act, Section 4. Now, so this happened in 2013. This case is taking place. Passed 2014. Law expires 2014, 2015. Immediately, I was living in the state of Texas at the time. Immediately, the state of Texas had submitted on 6 different occasions voter ID laws to the Supreme Court. All 6 times the Supreme Court said no, because it was unjust, It would create voter suppression, and it would negatively impact poor Black and Brown community, Black and Mexican American communities in particular.
Exactly.
Same, they submitted, I think, 5 or 6 times, got rejected all 5 or 6 times. Within 24 hours of Section 4 expiring, Texas submitted their voter ID laws, not to the Supreme Court because they no longer had to answer to the Supreme Court, but to the state to get it passed through the state. And it immediately passed. Right. And so what you saw was all of a sudden this proliferation of voter ID laws across the Confederate South because there was no longer the oversight of the Supreme Court. Right. And guess who it negatively affected? Blacks.
Our communities.
Black communities, once again. Right. Yeah. What you also saw was roughly 1,200 polling places closed between 2014 and 2015. Right. In some Confederate states, upwards of 40% of the existing polls were taken away. Over 80% of those existed in low-income Black and Brown communities. Right?
They had low voter turnout because, first of all, a lot of them didn't have ID or felt like they had the required ID.
Yep.
Some people were unidentified as a citizen.
Yeah.
And there was also a lot of people who were, I guess, tracking the polls to see, well, let's see how many people actually coming to this polling site. Yeah. And that's the reason why a lot of them were taken away. And then a lot of people weren't able to travel to the new sites. Let's say you don't have transportation. How are you going to get to your polling site?
Yeah.
Or it was kind of blurred as to where the new polling sites were.
Yes. There was a whole lot going on. And what you ultimately saw was about a 7 to 9% reduction in Black voter turnout for the next campaign. Now, granted, some of that may have been because of people who are running, right? But I think it would be disingenuous to ignore the fact that we literally closed down 1,200 polling sites, right, across the Confederate South, where the overwhelming majority of them were in low-income Black and Brown communities, right? And so then we transitioned from Obama, right? And we vote in Trump. And Trump runs on a campaign, literally, make America great again. Major talking points, tough on crime, law and order, taking back America.
Reagan again.
Reagan, Nixon, Johnson, right?
Johnson, exactly. We can go on and back in time.
Right? It's the same discourse over and over and over again. Which raises all kinds of questions, at least for me it does, right? And right now we're starting to see, again, we're having this movement in Black progress, right? This kind of coalition of supportive whites and Blacks coming together to try to advance America racially, specifically as it relates to anti-Blackness, right? And kind of rid of ourselves of anti-Blackness. Next slide, please. But I think it really does raise the question of, and this is where we get into the race part, right? What is it about Black advancement that elicits such a visceral and violent response from white America, not just politically, right, but socially?
Yeah.
Because what you see throughout history isn't just the state-sanctioned or government-sanctioned violence, right? But you also see governments deputizing, right, citizens to also be violent, right? You even see this with Trump recently. He talks about telling people to take up arms, right, to protect their land, right? This was a similar conversation that Johnson was having, right? These are similar sentiments that Reagan made, right, that Nixon made. And so we see these throughout history. And so it really does raise that question, like, well, what is it about Black advancement that's so unique? Because we don't see the same type of visceral reaction with other racial groups that try to advance.
Exactly.
Right.
And I noticed that in the advancement of, let's say, owning businesses and communities who are predominantly Black, if those communities are rising up in, let's say, stature, through history, it seems like they try to black out those neighborhoods. Like, oh, let's buy or invest in this neighborhood
Yeah.
and
Or
push
build
the
highways
black
over
and
them.
brown people out.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
I
said build highways over them,
No,
correct?
I
Yeah.
lived in Fort Worth, Texas for a brief period of time, and there was an area in Fort Worth, Texas that used to be a very lucrative and wealthy black area, black business area. And literally what the city did was they built an interstate over them,
Mm,
right? Because one of the things that made the area so lucrative was that you had to pass through there to go pretty much anywhere you wanted to go
right.
in the city. And so what they did, they built an interstate over there, and as a result, it killed all the traffic, and all those businesses died. And then the city went in and bought those vacant lots and turned them into townhomes, right? It's the whole
Exactly.
gentrification piece. Um, but I think it's interesting because, like, you think about other racial groups in this country. You think about Mexican Americans. You think about the indigenous people of this country, right? Who through colonization we wiped out, like Americans wiped out what 90 to 95% of them,
Mhm.
right? We're talking about the indigenous people of this continent, right? Mexican Americans, right? Who we went to war with them as well, right? And you think about, let's say, World War II, right? We go to war with Japan. We have Tokyo Jokyo, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
produced by Warner Brothers, which is a caricature, right, of a Japanese person that depicts them as hypersexual, violent, right, ignorant, and dangerous, right,
Mm-hmm.
justifying the war against them, right? But by the 1980s, anyone from the Asian province is considered a model minority,
Right.
right? Even if you look at people who are now considered white, you look at people of German descent, Italian descent, Jewish descent, right? When they actually came to this country, they were much further down on the social totem pole. But eventually they got subsumed up into whiteness. And they were able to move on this spectrum, right? From being closer to black to becoming white.
That's right.
You look at anyone from the Asian province, all of whom we've gone to war with at some point in this country, right? At some point, they were very close to black, and they're not white, but they're white-like, right? And this is
Mm-hmm.
a minority. Their proximity to whiteness has gotten much closer than it was 50 years ago, right? The indigenous people of this country, very similarly, right? So every other race has been able to move, has some flexibility in their ability to move like across this spectrum between black and white, right? And your value as a person who is non-white is largely, it is informed by your distance from blackness and your proximity to whiteness,
Exactly.
right? And so these two realities kind of constitute the structure in which every other race lives and participates, right? And this is in part because of how whiteness was initially defined. Because whiteness was not defined as an ethnicity. It was not defined as a culture. Like we saw this in 1923, United States versus
Mm-hmm.
Thin,
Yeah.
right? When Thin, he's like, listen, I am from, I am from an Aryan space, right? Like you
Right.
can't, and the judge is like, well, you don't look the part, right? And literally 3 years earlier, you have Asawa who goes in there and says, well, I look whiter than the whitest white person. My skin does.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, you're not from the right culture. So whiteness is neither culture nor race, but what it is in terms of, you look at how it was initially defined, whiteness emerged, and blackness as well, right? They emerged as social identities.
Yeah.
Out of Beacon's Rebellion, following Beacon's Rebellion. And the primary objective was to dismantle what we would now call probably a labor union, right? Where black and white workers were coming together to rebel against the wealthy elite. And so what they did was they divided them based on race. But in doing this, what they set up was they said, listen, if you are white, then you deserve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on, and it is an inherent, you inherently are owed because of your inherent value, right? Your physiological value, your ontological value, your theological value, right? You are allowed certain privileges and access. But the thing is, though, is that when you define someone based on their privileges and access, those things only have power and value in relation to someone who does not have them.
Exactly.
Right? So like in this weird twist, right? This kind of like Hegelian twist on power, right? It talks about like when power becomes all inclusive, right? The problem is that it turns on itself, Because if you have comprehensive power, then what you become dependent on is someone to act your power upon, right? So like, insofar as whiteness becomes this definition of access, it only retains any value, right? Its greatest value is always in relation to someone who has no access.
Exactly.
Insofar as whiteness is the optimal definition or the zenith of humanity, it has its greatest value only in relation to that which does not have humanity. And so in the ways that whiteness was defined, it was defined, white and black were defined antagonistically. Like that, you know what I mean? You have your protagonist and your antagonist, like that's how it is. So I think when you're talking about black progress, it's very different than other non-white groups who attempt to progress, because if black people progress, it disrupts the entire structure.
Yeah, it's like a threat, seen as, oh, when black people have progress, it goes to a higher level. It's more excellent, and you've seen that in communities that have built up the infrastructure of black businesses and their home life.
I think
their institutions, the black schools.
But I think it's a different type of threat, though, right? Because like if you look right now at wage earnings, people of Chinese and Japanese descent are some of the, or actually from the Asian province. Individuals from the Asian province are more likely than any other demographic group to get paid more than a white person doing the same job with the same level of experience and background. Right. Exactly. So you would think that that person would be your threat. Right. Exactly. But white America doesn't have a visceral reaction to their progress. Right. But black people, who are the least likely, right, literally the least likely demographic group to financially displace or even professionally displace a white person in this country, are considered as very threatening. But I think it has less to do with the economic structure of our society. I really think it points to a sense of identity, right? Because again, whiteness's greatest value in terms of a social identity, right, is only seen in contrast to blackness. In every social group that comes here that is neither black nor white, they understand their place in the spectrum based on their relative distance from or proximity to.
Exactly.
So these two benchmarks kind of, they are the foundations and the structures of our racial social hierarchy. And if you disrupt that, you disrupt everything, right? And you disrupt social identities and their corresponding values, which is, can be catastrophic. Exactly. But I think this is part issue we have with social movements, right? Next slide, please. I think that so much of our social movements, and rightfully so, they focus on legislation as it relates to political reform, right? Whether it's policing, right? Whether it's voting rights or access to schools, right? These, which all need to be done definitively. But the thing is, though, is that you can't legislate identity the same way you legislate law enforcement.
Exactly.
Right. And so I think that if we continue to focus solely on political legislation, we will see the same cycle over and over and over again. And once we come out of this current cycle of Black advancement as it relates to Black Lives Matter and all those stuff that's going on, right? The removing of monuments, you know what I mean? It's kind of integrated. Yeah. We're going to get another.
What's upsetting is that we're removing different parts of our society, but forgetting the parts that count. And a lot of people are just at the point of breaking, because ending the cycle is not, I don't know if removing everything is going to happen, because you're not removing what's inside people's thought process.
Well, see, and I think that's the thing, right? Like, we need to really focus on, try to focus, in addition to the political legislation, right? I think we also need to focus attention on educational institutions, right? And really decolonizing educational institutions and decolonizing our kind of tertiary means of socialization, i.e. like media, television, social media,
Right.
you know what I mean? And how these things, because while you cannot necessarily legislate identity, what you can do is you can shape institutions which
Mhm.
promote and produce certain identities. If that
Mhm.
right? But I think these are three different pillars that need to be happening at the same time. Because until white America has a new definition, a definition of whiteness that does not depend on the oppression and marginalization of blackness,
Mhm.
we would continue to see a considerable kickback every time we see black advancement.
Exactly. Well, it's
And
been taught. It's been taught in our school system for centuries in this country. I
yeah,
mean, it's been taught in families. The cycle is just continuous because it's our language. It's how we identify each other, even within in our own communities. We
yeah,
identify blackness in different levels.
yeah,
You've seen it with colorism. You've seen it with status, employment, and unemployment in the neighborhood you live in, and I mean down to the clothing or cars you have as an accessory. But the constant racial issue in the country now is, of course, echoed because of we have now cell phones, we have media, we have
yeah.
internet, we have complete control over what is viewed. Before it was hidden for a while.
Mhm.
It was talked about, but now we're seeing it up front every night almost. And I mean, I really appreciate you sharing the history. I mean, you got a history lesson within about a 50-minute time span, which is unreal. I mean, I wish we can talk more and learn more from you. Dr. Bryant, you've just been a wonderful guest tonight.
Thank you.
Before you leave, I also want to plug for August 4th at 7, we're going to have a conversation with artist Dakota Ayana, who created one of the letters in the Tryon Street Black Lives Matter in Uptown Charlotte. If you're ever in the area, please view this. This is going to be live on our Charlotte Mecklenburg Library website again on August 4th at 7. We are going to have more conversations with figures that matter, lives that matter, people that have made a difference in our society. Dr. Dante Bryant, you have made a significant change in our conversation, our thought process tonight. I know UNC-Charlotte is extremely grateful to have you on staff. Your students are gleaning from your knowledge, and I applaud you for all that you have done for the community in the past with your political work in the community. It has made an impact, and I hope you continue to make an impact, as
Thank you.
I will here at the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library.
I'm sure you will. I'm glad that you and I got to meet. You know,
Yeah, no, virtually, which is
I hope that we stay in touch.
we
Um,
will.
and yeah, no, anything that I can do to help support you all, please let me know. I think this is absolutely wonderful what you all are doing.
Yeah.
I'm
And
very
before you go, I tell you, I don't know if we have any questions from our virtual audience tonight, but let's just see if we have any moment to speak on that. I do see one question before we go. Can you speak to the gerrymandering and the impact on voting in North Carolina?
yeah, no, it's bad, right?
Oh,
That's what I can say. Um,
as we have seen in the last election.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll be honest, but to be honest with you, I mean, even with our judges, our local judges,
Yeah.
right? I used to work for the county, and when I first got with the county, I worked in criminal justice reform. Well, I ran a research department, did criminal justice reform, and I remember the number of judges of color who occupied the judicial floor,
Hmm.
and they rezoned everything
Yeah.
when it was time for the election. They pitted a lot of them against each other, so they ended up canceling each other out, right? And so I mean, it's happening at the gerrymandering is happening at every level. I don't know exactly specifically what you would like me to touch on, but it is and it's crazy because it's illegal, but it's not,
Hmm.
right? And that absolutely astounds me. Um,
Hmm.
that we're able to continue to do gerrymandering with
Exactly.
minimal legal consequences,
And
right?
what blows my mind is they've taken names of dead people to vote.
Yeah, yeah,
They have also used people who have not had their address in a long time, people that have moved on to other areas and used those names and those addresses to put votes in,
yeah.
padding votes. And we saw that in our last elections, which is very sad. Hopefully, we can reclaim that in November, when we go out to vote again.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, yeah.
It's rough.
It
Or,
is rough.
or threatening people to vote for a certain candidate,
Yes, yes.
it's it's an ongoing cycle. I really thank you for all of this knowledge that you've laid down on us tonight.
I
And
hope it was helpful.
we'll definitely have you back again for other topics and subjects that are going on in our society right now. There's so much to talk about.
There is a lot going on, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Again, like I said, I thank you for the opportunity. I genuinely do. I had a great time.
yeah.
Um, I'll tell you before I was nervous, which is odd. I typically don't get nervous talking to people for whatever reason. When it came to you, I was super nervous about having a conversation with you. But
It's okay. I'm gentle, and I don't bite. No. But it was a pleasure. It's like talking to an old friend, and I appreciate the openness and honesty and the knowledge that you shared tonight with us. It was
any,
great.
anytime.
And thank you, audience, for watching. And we hope to see you again.
All right. Take care.
You take care, Dr. Bryant.